Shadow Temple built an 8th-tier killing array for Levy. 4 archmages waited to trap him and draw Panda away. Levy was still a 6th-tier mage facing saints and legends. One mistake could expose Stormwind, Angelus, and his infant son. His panel accelerated learned skills and fused spell paths into new abilities, but tier gap still demanded speed, strategy undead, and prepared terrain. Levy proved it by killing an 8th-tier sky warrior himself. Then he turned wars, monsters, and dead saints into Stormwind's growth. But the chain of events began before Levy returned to center stage, with Redman hunting a far older disease inside Alpha. The first corpse belonged to Exum, leader of the Divine Eye Society, who had already escaped Redman once and would not receive that mercy twice. The Civil War had cracked Alpha open, and Exum tried using the chaos exactly as his organization had done for generations. Crawford sealed one route, while Redman drove straight through the predictive tricks that made Divine Eye assassins so difficult to corner. Their techniques read movements before attacks fully formed, giving ordinary opponents the terrifying feeling that every choice had already been seen. Against Redman, prediction only showed Exum how quickly the pressure was closing around his heart meridian. When Exum tried breaking away, Redman reminded him that his previous escape had already exceeded the amount of mercy available. Thunderstrike smashed through the remaining defense and crushed the life inside Exum's chest before another route could open. For several seconds, Crawford simply watched the body that had carried nearly a century of infiltration, murder, and political rot. Killing Exum ended one career, not the network he had spent decades hiding behind layers of people who barely knew one another. Redman pulled the storage ring from the corpse and searched it before the battlefield had even cooled. The first major prize was the Divine Eye secret technique, but the written method stopped at the 8th tier. That missing 9th tier confirmed Redman's suspicion that the final inheritance came directly from the Divine Eye Monarch rather than any portable record. The second discovery was more immediately useful. A surviving list containing 82 identified members of the organization. 4 of those names belonged to 8th tier professionals, and Redman believed the paper still represented less than half the real network. Victory had removed the head, but dozens of poisoned teeth remained embedded inside Alpha's institutions. Crawford wanted the names circulated through royal intelligence and military courts at once so every loyal commander could begin arrests. Redman refused to broadcast the purge too early, because frightened conspirators would scatter the moment they knew the Crown possessed the list. His plan was quieter: arrest useful targets first, then let the disappearances teach everyone else that silence no longer guaranteed safety. By then, the royal family had gained evidence, names, and an 8th tier predictive technique from one dead enemy. The next problem was harder to confiscate because it wore a ducal crest and still had legendary power behind it. Paul's rebellion was collapsing, yet the Phoenix family remained intact enough to turn defeat into a different kind of war. Redman warned Crawford that Phoenix could not be punished like an ordinary noble house whose estates disappeared after one failed conspiracy. A duke protected by legendary ancestry could survive penalties that erased lesser bloodlines completely. Crawford asked why Phoenix had risked reaching into hell and supporting a rebellion that could expose centuries of accumulated power. Redman had no document proving the motive, only a pattern stretching back roughly 4 centuries. Around that period, Phoenix had stopped displaying its legendary ancestor openly in family affairs. Without that protector, a ducal house could lose access to the resources that kept its strongest bloodlines competitive across generations. Redman suspected Phoenix had chosen hell, because slow decline frightened them more than the cost of damnation. If that was true, the coming purge was not simple punishment. It was another war against a family trying to avoid extinction. Redman moved before Phoenix could reorganize, appearing in Maryland province beside Crawford and Prince Thompson's in early August. Thompson's presence alone destroyed a major piece of Paul's story because soldiers had been told that this prince was already dead. Men who had mourned him now watched the supposed corpse ride openly beneath royal banners. Redman followed that shock with accusations designed to split Paul's army from the inside, instead of battering every legion from the front. He named Paul's secret cooperation with the Orcs through the Divine Eye Society. He tied Van Arvinus's murder to an effort that placed the Griffin Legion under Paul's control. He connected assassins inside Friesland and Frost Moon to the unrest that had erupted before the rebellion. The cult uprising that bled northern nobles and exhausted frontier armies joined the same chain of evidence. Disasters once treated as separate catastrophes suddenly pointed toward one political machine. Then Redman reached the coup inside Kangland City, and the deaths that had made Paul's forged succession possible. Edward II, Queen Catherine, and Zachary had all been presented as casualties of uncontrollable chaos. Redman accused Paul of using those deaths to manufacture both a crown and the civil war that followed. He also exposed the attempt to assassinate Thompson and erased the alternative heir before loyalists could rally around him. That mattered more to soldiers than abstract treason, because it suggested their prince had been sacrificing them to hide his own crimes. Redman offered officers a surrender structure carefully designed to separate fear from loyalty. Those who knowingly served the conspiracy could surrender and keep their families from being enslaved, though they would enter suicide units themselves. Officers who had followed orders without understanding the plot could earn lighter punishment through future service. Ordinary soldiers would not be prosecuted simply for obeying commanders they had no realistic power to challenge. The offer moved faster than Paul's messengers could rebuild his version of the war. Mid-ranking officers began comparing strange orders they had once accepted without knowing how the pieces connected. Some found contradictions in old deployments. Others found relatives buried because those same operations had needed expendable witnesses. Anger accomplished what months of Royal Cavalry pressure had failed to do. The 7th Legion turned on its own command structure before Paul's envoys could stabilize it. Units across Maryland followed, and central formations began breaking along the same political fault lines. North of Kanglan City, the rebel defensive screen collapsed almost overnight. One evening, Paul still possessed an army between himself and Redman. By morning, that army was arresting men who had ordered it to fight. Paul received the reports and finally lost the control he had guarded through every earlier defeat. He raged that Redman had returned too soon and that Thompson should have stayed dead. Phoenix representatives tried calming him, but their own position was becoming impossible to hide. They had backed a prince whose soldiers were defecting faster than Phoenix could replace them. Paul demanded explanations for Thompson, Zachary, and every survival that had ruined what once looked like a finished victory. Phoenix answered with a proposal to move him somewhere safer. That single word changed Paul's expression faster than another lost legion. In Phoenix language, safer meant a place where their family could decide his next move for him. Paul had spent months chasing the crown and now saw the chain attached to it. He refused to escape merely to become another family's decorated puppet. Phoenix insisted they could still place him on the throne once Redman's momentum weakened. Paul answered that a throne controlled by Phoenix would only be a more expensive prison. When Rosier approached, Phoenix lost the final reason to keep arguing openly around a prince they could no longer command. They released Paul rather than risk a fight against both him and Rosier at the same time. Rosier found the eldest prince alone, clutching a 9th-tier holy scroll in one hand. He asked why Paul had refused the escape route Phoenix was willing to provide. Paul laughed at the idea of fleeing one family only to belong to another. Then he demanded to know why Rosier had genuinely joined the rebellion if Naran blood still mattered to him. Rosier admitted he had wanted Redman removed and had meant that part of the rebellion completely. Continuing now, however, would destroy Naran while handing Phoenix everything that survived the wreckage. Rosier hated the man leading his family, but he would not burn the entire bloodline simply because of that hatred. Paul listened with something closer to envy than agreement. At least Rosier still had a family he could resent, without denying that it belonged to him. Paul said Naran had given him coldness, humiliation, and injustice for as long as he could remember. He no longer cared about inheriting the royal name, or even ruling the family that had rejected him. What he wanted was Naran's destruction, even if the throne disappeared with it. Rosier finally understood that they were no longer two failed claimants discussing survival. Paul had become willing to lose everything, as long as his relatives lost more. When Paul's grip tightened on the 9th-tier Holy Scroll, Rosier expected a final act of suicide. Instead, Paul hurled the sealed attack directly at him and forced an emergency defense. Holy power exploded against Rosier's barrier, covering the field with enough violent light to hide everything behind it. By the time the glare faded, Paul had activated a void traversing scroll and vanished. The eldest prince escaped without Phoenix, without an army, and without the throne he had spent months trying to steal. He had lost the civil war, but for the first time he was also free of every faction trying to own him. Rosier refused to chase blindly after a fugitive still carrying unknown spatial relics. Standing in the fading magic, he admitted that he had spent the rebellion beside a madman. Randolph and the surviving officers approached afterward, waiting for commands from a prince whose cause had effectively ended. Rosier told them to return to the family rather than follow him into exile. Their recapture of Kanglan City might count as enough atonement to save some of their futures. He ordered Randolph to tell Redman that Rosier was dead from that day forward. The man himself would leave Alpha and never return to the royal household. Before disappearing, Rosier gave one warning that made Paul's escape far more dangerous. The 9th-tier holy attack and void-traversing scroll had not come from Phoenix. Those relics likely belonged to a dead saint-level mage, which meant Paul had access to resources nobody had fully mapped. Rosier stepped through space and vanished from Alpha's immediate struggle, leaving the rebellion without a surviving claimant who still wanted the throne. 8 months of civil war ended with no triumphant prince standing over the wreckage. The faction that survived long enough to expose everyone else's crimes had won. But peace still had to be written into law. 3 days later, Redman and Crawford returned to Kanglan City and began assigning punishment on a scale Alpha had not seen in generations. Families that gambled estates on Paul watched entire bloodlines disappear from royal registers. Castles changed hands while surviving officers waited to learn whether their service could separate them from inherited treason. Far away in Levy read the decisions and felt his own frontier victories suddenly look very small. He had spent years fighting monsters, assassins, and armies along one dangerous edge of the kingdom. Redman had just turned a kingdom-sized civil war into confiscated land, broken titles, and rewritten command structures. Political accounting was now moving faster than swords, and Levy barely had time to appreciate it before Gordon Leon arrived with worse news. A Phoenix-linked branch was attacking Baron and pushing toward Frost Moon Province, threatening routes that Quint and Stormwind's shipbuilders still depended on. Then Gordon revealed the part that changed every calculation. Phoenix had sent its legendary ancestor onto the battlefield personally. Alpha had avoided open legendary combat inside its borders for more than a century. That quiet ended the moment Phoenix decided ordinary retaliation could no longer protect what remained of its influence. The royal family answered with Tyronville, the legendary knight guarding Narn's deepest foundation. Their clash around the eastern front tore at terrain with force ordinary formations could not meaningfully contain. Mountains cracked beneath exchanges that even 9th-tier spectators could barely approach safely. Levy was still far below that realm, and the distance between his current strength and legend suddenly looked much less theoretical. Neither combatant paid attention to soldiers scattering beneath them, which frightened Levy more than deliberate attacks from weaker enemies. One misplaced legendary strike could erase a company without either fighter noticing the loss. To watching nobles, the duel proved Phoenix still possessed terrifying teeth. To Redman, it confirmed that every next move required layers of insurance. To Levy, it became another number beside the same goal. Survive long enough to reach that ceiling. Phoenix soon gathered 6 9th-tier saints inside Saxony, expecting superior numbers to break Redman's defensive line. Their army advanced confidently while Redman yielded roads and ridges instead of contesting every approach. The patience looked weak until containers of Stormwind's Bloodfire oil opened across prepared channels. The liquid spread through the battlefield before Phoenix officers fully understood the smell. One ignition turned the chosen ground into a moving red inferno. Ordinary fire could be smothered, broken, or endured by strong professionals, but Bloodfire clung to armor, earth, and bodies. Soldiers broke formation before commanders finished shouting new orders. Some carried burning liquid into their own rear ranks while trying to escape. Others tore off armor only to discover the oil had already reached the clothing beneath it. A Phoenix officer screamed for water mages as wind drove red flame across another company. The battlefield stopped behaving like contested terrain and became a furnace that punished every retreat path. Redman's cavalry waited until panic opened the gaps he wanted. Royal Knights struck broken edges rather than charging the strongest Phoenix formations head-on. Saxony's defenders followed, cutting down soldiers already separated by fire and smoke. One military disaster fragmented into several smaller massacres, too quickly for Phoenix commanders to coordinate. The 9th-tier saints finally understood why Redman had refused a clean confrontation. He did not need to defeat their strongest people first. He needed to erase the army that made those people politically useful. A 9th-tier water mage named Nelson tried reaching the largest burning sector. Redman intercepted him personally and forced the mage to spend power on combat instead of suppression. Every second Nelson fought was another second Bloodfire spread without a high-tier answer. Crawford joked that Phoenix had finally learned what Stormwind sold by the barrel. Redman told him to save the humor until the corpse count stopped rising. Perez and Wright received orders to watch Shadow Temple movement rather than chase glory against visible saints. Zachary and Crawford remained positioned to reinforce whichever high-tier clash became unstable. The royal formation assumed Shadow Temple would not watch a ducal ally burn without trying to change the equation. That prediction became real when something dead struck Redman hard enough to tear the scorched ground open. The attacker carried the unmistakable aura of a corpse, yet moved with legendary force. Even Phoenix soldiers hesitated at the sight of a legendary corpse demon entering open war. Assets like that were usually hidden behind myths, not thrown into a battlefield already visible to half the kingdom. Crawford's expression hardened while Zachary abandoned his pursuit and turned immediately toward Redman. The corpse demon attacked again before the royal side could rebuild its formation around the new threat. Redman blocked, but the impact drove him backward through broken armor and burning earth. For several exchanges, Phoenix finally gained breathing room, while legendary pressure occupied the man directing the trap. Then cold rolled across the battlefield strongly enough to make Bloodfire hiss beneath spreading frost. Gweg, the Frost Lady and legendary ancestor of the Venus family, arrived with her descendants. Her presence turned Phoenix's hidden advantage into another balanced equation. She struck the corpse demon before anyone finished announcing her arrival. Ice and death power collided above the army, while shattered ground froze beneath them. Phoenix's emergency blade could no longer rescue the soldiers trapped below. Then Hell itself entered the same struggle through a new legendary presence. The Scythe Shadow King emerged with enough pressure to silence several 9th-tier fighters at once. He had crossed into the legendary realm only recently, which explained why Shadow Temple was suddenly willing to gamble so openly. Phoenix had expected a legendary demon and a legendary corpse to overwhelm the royal side's answers. The Church of Dawn destroyed that calculation when Priest Nelson arrived carrying the goddess scepter. The artifact did more than strengthen holy magic. Divine authority became almost physically present around the battlefield. The Scythe Shadow King attacked anyway, trusting his fresh advancement and Hell's resurrection cycle as insurance. Priest Nelson raised the scepter and tore through shadow defenses that had survived ordinary holy countermeasures. The demon tried retreating once the imbalance became obvious. Nelson refused to let a legendary enemy leave with the cultivation he had just earned. A final divine strike destroyed the body and forced the Scythe Shadow King back into Hell's resurrection cycle. Death would not erase him, but rebirth would strip away the legendary progress he had only recently achieved. Some victories killed an enemy. This one sent him back to the beginning of the hardest climb. Priest Nelson remained standing afterward, though the hand holding the goddess scepter trembled from the drain. He admitted the artifact had nearly emptied him, and a longer battle could have turned dangerous. The soldiers watching only saw that the church had arrived, and Hell had blinked first. Near the East Sea, Tyroneville sensed the shift while still pressuring Phoenix legend Kovich. Kovich had expected Shadow Temple's intervention to loosen the royal legendary response. Instead, his ally had been thrown back into Hell before accomplishing the rescue. Phoenix's wider position began collapsing across several provinces at once. The Roy and Randall families tried escaping before royal punishment reached their remaining strongholds. Roy's surviving 9th-tier professional crossed the East Sea route only to be hunted down before reaching lasting safety. Most of that family was destroyed before exile could become protection. One Randall 9th-tier professional managed to reach Aura and disappear beyond Alpha's border. That survivor became the exception, which showed how complete the royal counterattack had become. By the time Saxony's fires died, Paul's rebellion no longer existed as a military force. Phoenix remained dangerous, but its attempt to hijack the royal crisis had failed catastrophically. For Levy, the aftermath arrived in wagons instead of speeches. Roy territory opened for confiscation while land reserved for Gordon Leon's future line remained protected. Mia sent roughly 30,000 gold coins worth of supplies back toward Stormwind. 5,000 serfs followed, each one another pair of hands for farms, roads, walls, workshops, and future armies. 3 7th-tier Roy professionals crossed Levy's path before the withdrawal ended. He killed them, harvested the energy essence, and refused to press deeper just because more trophies might exist. Shadow Temple had already shown how quickly greed could become bait. 3 corpses were profit. Chasing a 4th into unknown ground was stupidity. Back in Stormwind, Levy converted that harvest into another round of talent reinforcement. Abilities that had carried him through lower tiers gained room for their next transformations. The royal family also came shopping for the weapon that had rewritten the Saxony battlefield. They wanted exclusive resale rights to Bloodfire oil throughout Alpha. Stormwind would still supply Tulip directly, but Tulip could no longer act as a middleman for the rest of the kingdom. Levy named his price in magical beast horses instead of ordinary gold. 100 mounts changed hands, turning burning oil into the foundation of future cavalry. The dangerous red liquid buried beneath Stormwind had become valuable enough to buy the bones of a mobile army. The rebellion's cleanup also triggered a huge redistribution of titles and confiscated estates. Fremont lands shifted. Franken rose in status. Randall territory was divided, and Clinton gained rank. Royal branches and allied nobles absorbed pieces abandoned by families that had chosen the wrong prince. Levy studied the grants and saw opportunity mixed with warning. A noble title looked permanent until one signature erased generations of inherited certainty. Stormwind had no reason to trust parchment more than strength, so Levy converted merit into defenses paper could not provide. He chose a 7th-tier giant magic crossbow with 10 matching bolts. He also secured materials for a 6th-tier war protection array and more conventional equipment. New Stormwind was already more than 10 times the scale of his first desperate settlement. Larger walls meant larger gaps, and every increase in population created more places an enemy could hurt him. The crown soon demanded that northern high nobles help rebuild legions battered by the Civil War. Skyhawk reinforcements reached the northeast, though even those forces still carried scars from earlier campaigns. Before the frontier fully settled, fresh information about Paul reached Levy. The eldest prince had survived every faction that tried to capture, crown, control, or kill him. Panda reacted less like a strategist than a man spotting treasure that had escaped payment. Paul still possessed saint-level relics, puppet technology, and information Levy badly wanted. The fugitive had found shelter inside Baron Ramirez's territory, where loyalty to Paul survived after the rest of the rebellion collapsed. Ramirez served him quietly while the kingdom assumed the prince had already escaped beyond royal reach. Paul learned that Angelus and Earl Pierce would soon hold peace talks inside Ramirez City. The meeting offered exactly the leverage desperation liked best. He could strike Angelus, destabilize Tulip, and recover political value in a single ambush. Pierce provided information about the meeting, but refused to join the assassination itself. Paul filled the gap with hidden professionals, prepared passages, and weapons concealed beneath the city. When Levy learned the talks were happening that same day, patience stopped being useful. Panda carried him across space fast enough to turn hours of travel into moments. Levy used soul descent on Jeweler and approached under a face nobody expected to matter. Above him, peace talks began inside a city already packed with hidden weapons. Angelus watched Pierce carefully, expecting negotiation and the usual noble deceit. Then secret passages opened and Paul's professionals flooded into the streets. For one sharp moment, Angelus believed Pierce had sold her directly into the ambush. Pierce shouted that he had never agreed to the attack and looked genuinely furious. The distinction would matter later, but it did nothing for soldiers suddenly fighting to keep Angelus alive. Magic crossbows rose from prepared positions before Tulip's forces could establish a stable defense. Levy reached through Jeweler and released intimidation across the firing lines. Hands shook, concentration broke, and several crossbow crews failed to complete movements they had rehearsed. Angelus saw the disruption without seeing the man causing it. Brennus recognized the movement of air wings and told her the impossible intruder was Levy. Her next conclusion was immediate. If Levy was here, Panda was probably somewhere close. That assumption gave Tulip's trapped soldiers permission to stop retreating like abandoned prey. Levy then stopped hiding how abnormal his magical reserves had become. Once Angelus committed to holding the ground, 9 suns burst hammered Paul's positions like repeated artillery from an invisible battery. Defensive formation shuddered under casts that should have exhausted an ordinary 6th-tier mage almost immediately. Levy kept firing, as though somebody else had agreed to pay the mana cost. Paul watched another prepared position vanish, and finally understood why reports about Stormwind's Lord always sounded exaggerated. The reports had been conservative, mostly because nobody enjoyed explaining how far outside normal cultivation Levy's combat pattern had moved. Then Levy opened his undead space and released professionals accumulated from previous victories. Dead mages formed ranks beside living Tulip soldiers and turned their spells against Paul's supporters. Every enemy mage Levy killed could become another body on his side, so attrition punished Paul in both directions. The longer his specialists traded casualties, the more the battlefield itself began feeding Levy's numbers. Paul answered by using 7th-tier dark magic and ordering his strongest surviving professionals forward. Scott, an 8th-tier Sky Warrior, received the simplest assignment on the field: kill Levy before the 6th-tier mage converted the entire ambush. Scott crossed the battlefield with speed ordinary soldiers could barely follow. Levy did not pretend the raw cultivation gap had disappeared. He layered defense, recognition, and prepared backlash instead of trying to win a clean exchange at Scott's preferred terms. Scott struck with the confidence of a professional hitting someone 2 tiers beneath him. The impact landed and Levy's defenses bent under the force. Then part of Scott's committed power came screaming back through the prepared rebound. He had attacked too hard to stop safely once his own momentum turned against him. The backlash tore through Scott's balance and opened the body Levy had been waiting for. Burning Blood activated before the Sky Warrior could rebuild distance. Airwings snapped outward while extreme/compressed Levy's approach into one violent line. Scott protected the center of his chest, expecting the most obvious lethal target. Levy changed direction at the last instant and drove through the left side instead. The blade reached Scott's heart before his body could fully react. An 8th-tier warrior stared at a 6th-tier opponent with no useful explanation left. Then the heart shattered, and Paul's remaining command structure lost one of its strongest pillars. Nearby enemies froze for a breath because the impossible part was not that Scott had died, but who had killed him. Paul recovered first and called Scott useless, because admitting the alternative was worse. If the warrior had not been incompetent, then Levy had become something Paul could no longer measure correctly. The prince recalled his 9th-tier dragon puppet and abandoned every position that could still be saved. Panda saw the metal giant moving and charged after it with personal resentment. Expensive things that refused to die properly had already offended him more than once. Paul disappeared into the hidden passages with his remaining elite while the surface battle collapsed. Angelus intended to stabilize the city and leave the chase to Levy. Levy took her with him because Paul's trail offered more than one person's revenge. Earth core power tore through collapsed tunnel sections faster than ordinary engineers could have cleared them. After roughly half an hour, the pursuit narrowed the distance to Paul and the 8th-tier puppet carrying him. The tunnels opened toward the eastern coastal mountains, where noble territory gave way to magical beast domains. At least 2 9th-tier creatures ruled regions deeper inside the range. Panda could fight one, but nobody wanted to invite both into the same argument by accident. Paul used that danger as cover and pushed farther into terrain most human forces avoided completely. The chase split around broken cliffs, attacks, and monster territory. Panda engaged the most dangerous puppet while Levy and Angelus stayed on Paul's route. Then a small pink serpent crossed their path with the confidence of a creature nobody sensible should underestimate. The enchanting pink snake looked harmless until its 8th-tier aura and perfume reached them together. Its fragrance carried poison, meant to disturb the mind before the fangs ever landed. Angelus tried locking it down while Levy used speed to avoid turns that were far sharper than the creature's size suggested. The snake struck from angles that made a tiny body harder to read than many giant monsters. One bite could end the pursuit without ever needing enough force to pierce heavy armor. Levy answered with Thunder Dragon instant kill again and again, but raw power meant little when the target kept slipping away. Angelus finally wrapped flame binding across the serpent's escape line and closed a cage behind it. Levy's next attack landed, where the creature no longer had room to disappear. The enchanting pink snake died inside fire, bright enough to bleach the nearby stone. That clean victory lasted only until a tyrant bear crashed into the area and turned the entire scene into chaos. The impact blasted Levy and Angelus apart before either could reset position. By the time they escaped the immediate danger, Panda and Tulip's reinforcements were nowhere nearby. Angelus had also become unnaturally quiet. The serpent's toxin had entered her system before the creature died. She swallowed a preservative potion, but hallucinations and unstable breathing continued spreading beneath the temporary protection. Angelus told Levy to get her out of the mountains before another beast found them. He carried her until the heavier monster pressure faded behind the ridges. Outside the range, the problem was no longer pursuit. It was medicine they did not possess. An 8th-tier priest could treat the poison safely, and there was no 8th-tier priest beside them. Levy searched every item he carried while Angelus's condition continued worsening. Then he remembered the undying ashes created by his resurrection talent. The ashes carried powerful fire vitality mixed with a trace of death. Too much could replace poisoning with another fatal problem, while using nothing meant letting the toxin finish its work. Levy fed only a tiny amount into Angelus's system and watched heat spread through her body. The poisonous distortion gradually lost ground, and her breathing steadied. No sane physician would have chosen that treatment first, but Stormwind rarely enjoyed sane first choices. When Levy later checked his panel, the incident connected to changes much larger than one improvised cure. Ultimate speed had reached Earth level and now multiplied his speed fivefold. Air wings and no distance remained, while a new line showed extraordinary evolution beginning in his legs. The transformation had only reached 1/10 of completion. Undying physique had also reached Earth level, multiplying his physical quality fivefold. Blood Ember and rebirth from ashes remained its defining effects. Extraordinary evolution had begun in his blood as well, again at only 1/10. Panda studied the changes and gave Levy a less comfortable explanation than another routine skill upgrade. True transcendence normally began when a professional approached the Saint Realm. Levy's body was already starting pieces of that process ahead of his visible cultivation. Panda had no comforting answer for what happened when talents forced the body to evolve before the cultivation level caught up. He did, however, bring back a badly damaged 9th-tier dragon puppet as compensation for the interrupted chase. The wrecked machine looked expensive enough that Panda demanded credit for every broken component. More importantly, Paul had been captured along with the secret behind those puppets. The prince possessed a token connected to the ruins of St. Kurt Nifa. That 9th-tier puppet master had created a legacy site intended to identify a worthy successor. Paul had entered through the token and subdued one 9th-tier dragon puppet along with two 8th-tier puppets. The most valuable laboratory remained sealed because he had failed the inheritance test itself. Levy asked what kind of examination had stopped a man carrying so many relics. Kurtnifa tested puppetry talent by making candidates construct puppets. Levy's mood improved immediately because practical tests were exactly where his panel became unreasonable. He only needed enough basics for the system to recognize the skill. After that, attribute points could turn terrible homework into mastery fast enough to insult ordinary training. Panda asked whether Levy was seriously planning to cheat a dead saint's inheritance examination. Levy answered that the dead saint could complain after they finished collecting the technology. Panda had no moral objection, only an immediate dispute over percentages. Levy wanted Angelus included because magical artifact construction overlapped heavily with puppet theory. She was an 8th-tier mage, an experienced artifact maker, and had helped capture Paul. Panda accused Levy of trying to turn one expedition into a husband and wife discount package. He insisted Levy and Angelus should count as one share if they insisted on arriving together. Levy pointed out that Panda had already damaged the most expensive puppet they might have studied intact. Panda argued that breaking it proved how much danger he had personally removed. Angelus finally told both of them to stop embarrassing themselves and focus on what Saint Kurtnifa had actually pursued. The old puppeteer had wanted more than ordinary battle constructs. His research aimed at a legendary puppet capable of crossing the profession's known ceiling. Angelus warned that any legendary design would probably be incomplete. No confirmed puppeteer in their current magical tradition had produced a true legendary combat puppet. Incomplete research was still priceless because failed attempts from a dead genius could teach more than a living craftsman's finished toy. The group entered the inheritance route with Panda, still calculating how much metal his contribution deserved. Levy passed the practical test by combining learned fundamentals with the panel's accelerated mastery. Angelus reached the archive she wanted and found the complete black iron golem secret technique preserved inside. The inheritance filled gaps that modern artifact construction approached only indirectly. She agreed to copy the technique for Levy instead of sealing it inside Tulip. Other records pointed toward research on legendary-grade constructs, missing treasures, and the unfinished routes St. Kurtnifa had explored. The laboratory had failed to build a legend, but its research map survived the man who created it. Paul watched Levy and Angelus divide knowledge. He had spent years treating as private leverage. His usefulness ended when the last reliable answer had been extracted. Levy did not arrange another prison, ransom, or political exchange. He burned Paul completely, leaving no body, soul, or puppet trick available for resurrection. The eldest prince who had helped tear Alpha apart disappeared into ash without a throne or an audience. Levy waited until nothing remained that could reasonably become tomorrow's emergency. For years, Paul had been a political enemy, military threat, and unfinished expense. Now that debt had finally stopped accumulating interest. The frontier immediately filled the empty space with another problem. By early February, Levy rode east toward the new barony belonging to Klein. Klein had finally become a lord in the eastern Grey Mountains and greeted Levy by complaining that Stormwind's Viscount had skipped his founding celebration. Levy replied that surviving long enough to visit afterward was a more practical gift. The joke faded when trade routes and future defenses entered the discussion. Klein's territory could become another outlet for Stormwind goods moving along the coast. Stormwind's own growth would send merchants, roads, and soldiers through Klein's developing lands in return. Levy also asked him to investigate a much older question. He wanted to know which Orc Legion had attacked Mark Fortress in the year 6626. The date sounded historical, but Levy's tone made it clear he considered the answer unfinished business. Before Klein could dig deeply, newer Orc tracks appeared much closer to home. Stormwind had bought breathing room through winter, and spring was preparing another war. Levy returned to New Stormwind and found a city that no longer resembled the desperate refuge he had inherited. 3 connected castles anchored the eastern, western, and northern sides of the expanded settlement. The walls now stretched roughly 3.5 kilometers, around more than 250,000 square meters. In an emergency, almost the entire territory could crowd behind those defenses for a short period. Visitors saw impressive scale. Levy saw everything that still sat outside the walls. Farms, villages, mines, and workshops had expanded far beyond what one city could protect. The Cane River needed its own fortified line before another major Orc migration reached the frontier. North Castle had become almost entirely military, with storm cannon production operating nearby. Royal wagons kept arriving for Bloodfire oil under the exclusive agreement. Levy stored large reserves inside the city and even larger quantities in spatial rings. Amy dyed the dangerous liquid so transport crews could distinguish it immediately from ordinary oil. Near the end of February, Nui delivered the report everyone had been expecting. Orc scouts had appeared beyond the northern approaches. The next southward invasion was no longer a question of whether, only how many days remained before the main force arrived. Levy called his officers into North Castle, instead of letting rumors spread through taverns. Royal intelligence confirmed that the orcs intended to exploit Alpha's civil war losses and political exhaustion. Stormwind's veterans reacted with an excitement that would have horrified Levy during his first years on the frontier. To them, orcs were enemies, but also walking military merit and future cultivation resources. One soldier joked that the beasts had brought the spring bonus themselves. Parker told him to survive before spending rewards he had not earned. Levy let the laughter settle before putting the actual plan on the table. After this war, Stormwind would expand the navy and finish the Cane River fortifications. If the campaign opened enough territory, Pied Valley and the Grey Mountains could receive new forts as well. He tied those projects directly to victory because he expected the war to end faster than the orcs expected. Instead of waiting behind walls, Levy wanted the enemy regretting the mountain crossing before reaching a fortress. Jenkins and Anthony received orders to begin spring planting from east to west immediately. Jenkins worried that crops might ripen just in time for an orc army to steal them. Levy told him the harvest would still belong to Stormwind because the war would finish first. The confidence sounded reckless until he explained the crown's political pressure. Prince Thompson needed a visible frontier victory after civil war had damaged faith in the throne. That meant the northern armies would receive support because the royal family could not afford another humiliating season. Scout reports narrowed Stormwind's direct opponent to the Bearman Jeremy Legion. The main force stood roughly 2 weeks from emerging fully through the Savage Mountains. Bearmen were brutally strong and much slower than several other orc races. That combination made them terrifying at close range and unusually vulnerable to prepared fire zones. Levy reviewed the major orc royal bloodlines with his commanders before proposing the ambush. Behemoths were the worst brute force opponents. Dragonvein kobolds brought priests and dangerous magic. Bearmen brought power, endurance, and enough mass to make retreat painfully slow. Levy wanted to punish that last weakness before Jeremy ever reached Grey Fortress. He carried the proposal to Bruce, commander of the fortress defense. Bruce expected another young noble requesting reinforcements and received an offensive operation instead. Stormwind's reported strength had grown beyond Grey Fortress in several categories. Bruce read the numbers twice before forwarding the plan to Frost Moon Command. When neighboring barons joined this discussion, Klein asked the most uncomfortable question. Could Levy actually kill an 8th-tier professional if one anchored the enemy command? Levy answered that he and Angelus had already killed an 8th-tier warrior and an 8th-tier magical beast in combat. Klein stared for a moment and decided that counted as yes. 6 neighboring barons committed squadrons instead of waiting behind separate walls. Klein brought 3. Otto brought 5. Juno and Simon each brought 4, while Bryson and Carey added 2 apiece. Levy assigned sectors, rather than letting noble pride decide where everyone wanted to stand. Bloodfire reserves went into terrain where slow bearmen would have the fewest useful escape directions. Archers received overlapping fields, cavalry waited beyond obvious retreat lanes, and storm cannon crews concealed their barrels. On the 3rd day, harpies appeared above the reconnaissance zone. One scout already belonged to Levy through a Dominator contract and reported what the enemy saw while still reporting to the enemy. Stormwind's forward units staged skirmishes designed to look nervous rather than carefully choreographed. Every retreat invited the bearmen farther toward the prepared killing ground. Jeremy's officers saw scattered resistance and concluded the human defense was still assembling. That assumption survived until the fire started. Bloodfire rolled through the chosen corridors before the heavy orc formation could turn around. The western escape toward Pied Valley suddenly looked like another furnace waiting to close. Smoke erased sightlines while commanders shouted conflicting retreat directions. For one sharp minute, Jeremy's legion stopped behaving like an army and became thousands of isolated decisions. Stormwind's hidden weapons opened from the ridges at exactly that moment. Storm cannon blasts broke dense clusters while crossbows targeted professionals trying to restore order. Cavalry struck survivors escaping the first burning line and wheeled away before countercharges could trap them. The neighboring barons finally understood why Levy had insisted on attacking before any siege began. Inside a fortress, bearmen could choose when to withdraw from a failed assault. Inside this valley, Levy had chosen their retreat routes days before they arrived. Jeremy's 8th-tier commanders entered personally, because somebody had to create a path for the Legion. Levy met them with every layered advantage he had spent years assembling. Defense came first, intimidation second, then flame body and burning blood together. Stored energy from devouring sea flooded muscles already reinforced far beyond what his visible cultivation suggested. The first 8th-tier Bearman swung hard enough to flatten an ordinary 6th-tier professional through armor. Levy let prepared protection absorb what it could, and moved through the weakest angle recognition had mapped. The Bearman's eye became the only target that mattered. Steel and condensed force punched through that opening toward the brain. A body built to survive battlefield punishment collapsed because one vulnerable point was still flesh. Levy withdrew before the corpse reached the ground, refusing to celebrate inside another 8th-tier attack range. The second commander saw what happened and stopped treating him like a lower-tier nuisance. That caution bought the Bearmen several exchanges, but cost surrounding soldiers time they did not have. Levy used intimidation at the exact moment the enemy needed concentration most. The mental break lasted less than a heartbeat. Against Levy's current speed, a heartbeat was generous. He forced open another lethal line and dropped the second 8th-tier Bearman. Nearby Stormwind soldiers roared, but the sound disappeared beneath cannon fire and burning timber. Levy saw 2 corpses worth essence, possible undead conversion, and enough military merit to alter noble careers. War did not make the dead less tragic, but leaving usable value behind would not bring them back. Jeremy's legion began collapsing once its command layer disappeared. Mia returned overhead with the Skyhawk squad while surviving Harpies scattered toward the mountains. Only 6 Skyhawks had been lost in the aerial fighting. The price hurt, but the enemy scouting screen was almost completely broken. Levy ordered pursuit only as far as the planned containment zones. A perfect ambush did not need to become a sloppy chase through unknown woods. Night settled over ground still glowing red where Bloodfire had not fully died. Allied commanders gathered around rough tables to compare casualty lists, captured banners, and merit claims. Nobody needed a speech to understand the scale of the result. An Orc legion had expected frontier fortresses and had been nearly annihilated before reaching them. Captured equipment, magical beasts, materials, and professional corpses created a second harvest behind the military victory. Levy examined the damaged body of one 8th-tier Bearman and grimaced at how inconvenient the kill had made undead conversion. Panda would have called that complaining about free treasure. Levy called it battlefield quality control. Energy essence from the fight gave him another chance to reinforce ultimate power. At Earth level, the ability multiplied his current physical force 5-fold. Burning blood and flame body could stack on that foundation during short bursts. Extraordinary evolution also began inside his hands, again at only 1/10 completion. His legs, blood, and hands were now changing ahead of the Saint Realm, in separate directions. Levy did not know what would happen once those partial transformations met inside one fully transcendent body. That uncertainty made information about the Saint Realm more valuable than another easy trophy. Grey Fortress sent confirmation of the victory toward Frost Moon. Merchants carried rumors farther south before court officials even received verified totals. Royal commanders had wanted a visible victory for Thompson. Levy handed them a destroyed Orc legion before the main northern campaign fully opened. The success also changed what neighboring nobles expected from Stormwind. A territory once treated as expendable frontier bait had become the ally other barons wanted beside them. Klein said reputation was finally becoming useful rather than merely dangerous. Levy replied that useful reputations attracted people eager to borrow them without paying. Then news from the wider front proved the Northern War had only changed shape. Franken and Puss Fortress were absorbing pressure much heavier than Stormwind's sector. Daniel, a 9th-tier Dragon Veen kobold, led multiple legions against the Puss line. Crawford and the Royal Mage Order reinforced Arthur while northern nobles filled every gap they could. Stormwind had removed one legion. The North still had an entire war to survive. Orc High Command did not answer the Bearman disaster with another immediate charge. Graham's priesthood and senior officers compared surviving scout testimony against reports of the Burning Valley. Bloodfire had changed the assumptions behind every slow-massed assault plan. A formation could endure arrows and even artillery for a while. It could not advance normally when every retreat route had become burning liquid. Orc commanders began demanding more water and ice priests before risking another prepared valley. The hesitation bought Alpha something more useful than another small victory. Walls could be repaired, wounded soldiers rotated, and magical equipment shifted between threatened sectors. Stormwind used the breathing room to improve logistics instead of chasing glory elsewhere. A small spatial teleportation array entered Levy's planning as a way to shorten critical movements. Its range was limited compared with Saint-level void travel, but limited distance could still save hours on a frontier. Royal messengers also arrived with requests that said suspiciously like shopping lists. Other fronts wanted the weapon that had turned Stormwind's ambush into a furnace. Levy had already sold exclusivity, and now discovered that exclusive distribution did nothing to reduce demand. A royal representative arrived after another brutal series of engagements carrying battle reports from Maka and Puss Fortress. The verified numbers looked crazier than the rumors moving through merchant roads. Maka Fortress had destroyed 1 Bearman Legion, 1 Sphinx Legion, and 1 Crocodilian Legion. 4 8th-tier orcs died there alongside 11 7th-tier professionals and nearly 30,000 soldiers. Puss Fortress answered with 2 Kobold Legions and 1 Minotaur Legion destroyed. 3 8th-tier orcs, 9 7th-tier professionals, and more than 40,000 enemies fell in that sector. Levy read the totals twice, because they looked like somebody had accidentally added another army. He wondered whether Alpha had secretly moved Central Legions north without telling frontier nobles. Before he could ride to Grey Fortress for answers, Earl Hardin arrived on a griffin. Hardin laughed when Levy admitted he planned to ask Bruce about the victories. He said Bruce knew less than he did and invited himself inside for the easier explanation. The crown had relied on Bloodfire, but Prince Arthur had made the trap truly vicious. Puss Fortress deliberately tolerated repeated probing attacks until orc commanders believed no major ambush existed. Auxiliary troops died by the thousands, while enemy scouts mapped defenses and confirmed exactly what the orcs wanted to believe. Arthur kept important reinforcements hidden and allowed harpies to report a deliberately incomplete picture. When the main royal and frontline legions finally committed, the defense stopped pretending to be ordinary. Bloodfire turned packed formations into escape problems before hidden strength struck from protected positions. Even Levy was shocked because Stormwind had invented the material without imagining deployment on that scale. Hardin said the crown wanted more immediately, which explained his unusually friendly visit. Levy asked whether the court remembered that Bloodfire still came from one territory with finite production. Hardin replied that war had never been famous for respecting production schedules. Both men were already thinking about the same strategic problem. If every fortress copied Arthur, Stormwind's reserves could disappear faster than miners and refiners replaced them. Levy refused to become the kingdom's unpaid furnace just because his product worked too well. The next shipment became a trade for cultivation resources instead of patriotic applause. Hardin accepted because another northern victory mattered more to the throne than squeezing Stormwind's margins. The negotiation also showed Levy how far his influence had moved beyond his own walls. One substance discovered beneath his territory was changing campaigns involving princes, ducal families, and 9th-tier commanders. That was power, but it also meant every ambitious house would eventually care who controlled the source. Stormwind could sell Bloodfire only while Stormwind remained strong enough to choose its buyers. Levy marked that lesson beside the production targets after Hardin left. A weapon valuable enough to save the kingdom was valuable enough to make its maker a target. Levy offered another 2,000 tons of Bloodfire oil, rather than hoarding every remaining reserve. He did not ask for gold because low-level cultivation potions could create future professionals faster than another stack of coins. The royal representative agreed, while burning orcs still mattered more than favorable trade terms. Levy warned that the current stockpile could not feed unlimited battlefield appetite. Only roughly 2,500 tons remained immediately available after the latest shipment. Stormwind could accelerate another 5,000 tons during the coming month. After that, stable output would settle closer to 2,000 tons each month. The royal official heard production limits. Levy heard the next industrial expansion target. By late April, orc offensives across much of the frontier slowed or stopped. 9th-tier leaders Grum and Cease ordered pauses while commanders searched for counters to Bloodfire tactics. Daniel hated the delay because every quiet day helped Puss Fortress repair its defenses. Even he could not ignore what happened to armies entering prepared fire corridors without proper support. The orcs changed the composition of their next attacks instead of abandoning them. More ice priests and water specialists moved forward to suppress Bloodfire before main formations committed. When the war resumed, every major assault carried heavier magical support and fewer assumptions. Franken and Puss immediately became the hardest sectors again. Daniel pushed Puss aggressively, trying to avenge earlier losses and restore orc confidence. Crawford, Arthur, royal mages, and northern nobles answered with layered defense rather than heroic charges. Stormwind had taught the kingdom a weapon, and the enemy had learned from it too. Levy expected that problem and stopped treating Bloodfire like a permanent answer. Stormwind itself became unusually quiet while major armies fought farther west. Harpies avoided the Cane River after repeated encounters with dangerous anti-air defenders. An 8th-tier puppet patrolled one sector while Laddie, the twin-winged ghost lion, covered another. Jenkins kept planting and moving supplies because soldiers still needed food after military merit stopped feeling exciting. Then Little Kun chose the Western Storm Bay for another breakthrough. Dragon Ball power around the young narwhal disturbed creatures across the nearby sea. Swarms of blue sword-flying fish arrived, irritated by the energy radiating through the water. Each fish carried a long blue blade on its head, sharp enough for enchanted weapon components. They could burst from the sea, glide through the air, and stab anything unfortunate enough to stand in the way. Levy realized protecting Little Kun also meant surviving an airborne seafood argument. The first wave launched from the water like living spears. No distance carried Levy away from trajectories that would have skewered a slower professional. Earth core increased gravity across their glide paths and dragged several attacks lower. Wind Illusion Shadow handled the rest while Levy's enchanted sword punished every fish passing too close. The swarm attacked again because irritation apparently outweighed pattern recognition. Levy killed more and began collecting bodies before the next wave had even fully formed. Those blue blades could replace expensive piercing materials on future crossbow bolts. The monsters were trying to murder him, with their most valuable body part first. He deployed water sword flying flowers around the damaged concealment array, protecting Little Kun. Then illusory sea tide dance swept a wider section of the swarm away from the breakthrough site. Fish he had already killed became undead and immediately attacked their living relatives. Every new corpse expanded Levy's side until the surviving swarm finally reconsidered the fight. The blue sword flying fish fled toward deeper water, and Levy pursued only briefly. Useful defense did not need to become another reckless chase. Undead fish retrieved more than 80 usable corpses after the water settled. Little Kun completed the advancement and greeted Levy with an affectionate call. The young narwhal rubbed against him hard enough to nearly knock him sideways. Levy told it that affection did not erase the trouble caused by attracting an airborne swordfish army. Little Kun answered with another pleased sound that suggested the lecture had accomplished nothing. Levy sent it back towards Storm Bay before another magical creature interpreted the Dragon Ball as an invitation. The recovered fish corpses went directly to craftsmen rather than ordinary monster storage. Their natural blades were tougher than many forged alternatives at the same grade. One sea attack had delivered future crossbow ammunition already attached to the materials. After replacing the damaged concealment formation with a 6th-tier colorless world array, Levy returned to life magic. Blood of the Earth taught him to borrow restorative force from terrain, instead of personal reserves alone. Grant of Wisdom pushed life magic toward support functions beyond simple healing. Regeneration handled sustained recovery, while Heart of the Elements connected living systems with elemental energy. Those 4 spells gave his panel enough structure to attempt another innate fusion. Emerald Coral provided the life-aligned focus as Levy completed the final spell model. Resurrection of All Things appeared as a wide-area ability with 2 distinct functions. The first restored vitality and stamina across friendly forces during prolonged battle. The second awakened elemental spirits from surrounding natural energy and directed them into combat. Levy tested the effect beside water because the environment made formation easy to observe. Small water spirits appeared in shapes that looked more curious than terrifying. That did not bother him because battlefield value did not require an intimidating face. Enough spirits could distract, carry, obstruct, and exploit terrain while living soldiers recovered behind them. The spell mattered because Stormwind was becoming too large for one sword, even Levy's. His best abilities were increasingly changing what whole formations could survive, rather than only what he could personally kill. That was the difference between a strong baron and a territory learning to remain strong, while its lord fought somewhere else. News from the Western Front arrived while Levy was still testing those possibilities. Redmond's faction and the Lincoln family had engineered another successful counterattack against major orc forces. Additional 9th-tier bearmen stabilized the retreat before it became a complete disaster. They could stop the collapse, but they could no longer restore the momentum the orcs had possessed earlier. Levy soon returned to an older question involving the Fox clan and St. Kurt Nifa's missing treasure. Flora brought tribal information about a human mage's remains discovered decades earlier. Lionel had found those remains, and one ancestor had taken the dead mage's storage ring. That ancestor later advanced rapidly and eventually became a 9th-tier sacred fox. The timing made Levy and Panda share exactly the same greedy suspicion. St. Kurtifa's most valuable inheritance might have left the ruins long before Paul ever found them. The Fox clan could be holding the trail to a legendary mage's treasure without understanding the full origin. Levy stored the question instead of marching into another tribe with half an answer. The larger orc war ended before that treasure hunt became urgent. Stormwind's army returned to normal operations with heavier battle records than the force that had marched out. The canyon ambushes produced 1 8th-tier kill, 2 7th-tier kills, 5 6th-tier kills, and 13 5th-tier kills. Hundreds of lower-tier fighters and thousands of ordinary orcs also died across the same operations. Across 2 major ambushes, Stormwind earned 1 first-class merit and 3 second-class merits. 3 third-class merits followed, more recognition than many noble houses collected across generations. Levy kept the highest value merits instead of converting everything into immediate gold. Lower rewards became giant crossbows and naval equipment for the fleet still under construction. Orcs had arrived expecting food, prisoners, and frontier loot. They left Stormwind with thousands dead and several warships worth of equipment financed by their defeat. Levy then turned from killing enemies to building institutions that could make the next war cheaper. John presented another improvement to the Heavenly Fire meditation method. Repeated revisions based on real practitioners had made the modified wizard path smoother than the inherited version. Levy decided every wizard method used by Storm Academy should eventually receive the same treatment. A school that taught bad old methods faster would only industrialize old mistakes. He pushed warship design toward practical construction rather than elegant naval theory. Old Charlie became commander-in-chief of the developing fleet structure. Creel, previously an infantry commander, was chosen to manage naval operations and receive battalion-level status. His pay tripled with the responsibility, because difficult-to-replace sailors should not feel cheaply hired. Stormwind still lacked trained naval officers, so the First Fleet needed borrowed experience before it could develop original doctrine. Levy gave Old Charlie a Hell Soulstone and a 4th-tier Wind Spirit Crystal for further growth. Frankenstein's alchemy entered the same training push, beside more conventional magical disciplines. Wendy and Amy discovered that helping Levy build a modern territory now included mandatory alchemy lessons. Their complaints changed nothing. Alchemy became compulsory inside Stormwind's magical education track. Levy had once bought craftsmen because he lacked people capable of building what he imagined. Now he was building schools meant to produce future craftsmen before emergencies demanded them. The new Navy exposed a different shortage that timber and money could not solve. Ships required officers who understood tides, formations, signaling, navigation, damage control, and discipline at sea. Creel had battlefield experience, but infantry instincts alone could not create a professional fleet. Levy arranged months of training inside Tulip territory, where Coral City maintained the region's largest working military harbor. Before leaving, he tested another effect emerging from unfinished extraordinary evolution. Short-range void traversal had become possible without the same strain earlier spatial movement caused. The distance was only around 1 kilometer, insignificant beside true saint-level travel. For Levy, 1 instant kilometer was still another gap an assassin could no longer trust. Every partial evolution was making geography less reliable for his enemies. Then a much stranger enemy tried using distance in the opposite direction. Deep in hell, Levy's 7th-tier undead had been hunting 6th-tier blood demons for potion materials. He needed many bodies and had already collected several without serious resistance. A danger warning suddenly screamed before he completed the next summoning connection. Something vastly stronger had entered one of those undead from the other side. A 9th-tier Hell Prince had possessed the 7th-tier corpse and was using Levy's own link as a bridge. Levy cut the summoning short, but hostile power had already reached through the connection. Pain tore through him as life force drained in a way ordinary physical injuries could not explain. Blood Ember activated first. Rebirth from ashes stabilized what the invisible attack kept trying to consume. Panda arrived after sensing the crisis and found Levy fighting an enemy that was not physically present. The attacker was Prince Bloodcloud, using the undead connection as a path into Stormwind's lord. Levy hated the idea of destroying 3 7th-tier undead simply to guarantee safety. Panda told him dead tools were cheaper than a dead owner and advised remembering priorities. They severed the link before Bloodcloud could force a full descent through it. Levy survived, but remote undead operations in hell stopped feeling routine. An army of corpses was useful only until something stronger learned how to ride one home. The naval mission still had to continue despite hell trying to interrupt the schedule. Levy traveled toward Tulip and met a more familiar danger in the form of family politics. Brennus received him with the strained hostility of someone offended by a guest he could not openly reject. Levy ignored most of it because Coral City mattered more than another nobleman's mood. The port held 24 military vessels across several magical grades. 4 were 2nd tier, 8 were 3rd tier, and 12 were 4th tier. For Stormwind, that harbor was a living classroom no blueprint could replace. Adrian, Angelus's uncle and lord of Coral City, saw Levy arrive and smelled money before the introductions finished. He immediately began listing fees, harbor expenses, training costs, and every inconvenience a visiting fleet might create. Levy listened until the list became creative enough to deserve professional respect. Then he placed a 60,000 gold ticket where Adrian could see it clearly. Angelus had already approved the arrangement, and Levy asked whether her uncle still saw a problem. Adrian's financial concerns achieved miraculous spiritual enlightenment. Coral City had apparently always been eager to support Allied naval development. Creel and his selected officers remained there, months learning the work properly. They studied patrol patterns, formation sailing, harbor management, navigation, combat signaling, and damage control. When they returned, Stormwind finally had officers capable of teaching sailors instead of imitating merchants. Levy also learned how Tulip treated islands beyond Alpha's recognized coastline. Those islands effectively belonged to whoever could develop and defend them. That legal ambiguity made naval strength economically valuable before enemy fleets ever appeared. A harbor could protect trade, while a fleet could create new territory from empty maps. Before returning north, Levy visited Angelus and brought another enormous spatial ring of Bloodfire oil. The gift was practical enough to avoid sounding romantic and expensive enough to avoid sounding careless. Then Levy noticed something different around Angelus before she explained anything. A faint milky scent lingered near her, strangely domestic for the woman he associated with battlefield formations. He was still processing that detail when a baby began crying nearby. Anna moved first and said little Anduin was hungry. Angelus took the child with the calm familiarity of someone who had done this many times. Levy stopped thinking about oil, fleets, and trade rights at once. He counted backward through dates with increasing suspicion and decreasing faith in coincidence. The timing fit far too neatly with a private night he and Angelus had avoided discussing publicly. Levy looked at the baby again and immediately began treating several features as evidence. Angelus watched his expression with the patience of someone allowing a slow student to finish basic arithmetic. He asked the question indirectly because direct confidence suddenly felt harder than fighting an 8th-tier warrior. Angelus confirmed enough to make denial ridiculous. The exiled second son who once came to Stormwind merely trying to survive now had a child. More importantly, that child connected Stormwind and Tulip in a way marriage paperwork never had emotionally. Levy held Anduin with the caution of someone convinced babies were more fragile than legendary artifacts. Priest Nelson noticed his stiff arms and advised supporting the child's head before discussing dynastic futures. Levy adjusted immediately, offended that priestly instruction had become necessary for basic fatherhood. Angelus observed that battle instinct apparently did not include knowing which end of an infant required support. The baby stopped crying once settled, which Levy interpreted as evidence he had mastered the technique. Anna quietly corrected his grip again before that confidence became dangerous. Nelson suggested the name Anduin while Levy processed an unexpected association. For one alarming second, he wondered whether the priest shared knowledge that should not exist in this world. Levy cautiously suggested Vion instead and watched Nelson's face for recognition. Nelson only asked what the name meant, genuinely confused by the strange detour. Relief hit Levy hard enough that Angelus noticed he had been testing something. He abandoned the experiment and admitted Anduin sounded better after all. Then Levy added Storm as the child's family name instead of Lewis. Angelus asked whether he intended to rebuild a separate house around the frontier title. Levy answered that Anduin would not inherit a rebuilt family. The boy would become the founder of House Storm in his own right. Everyone nearby needed a moment to decide whether Levy was joking. He was not. Stormwind had become more central to his identity than the family that expelled him. Giving Anduin that name turned the territory from an assignment into a family line. It also prevented future arguments from beginning with Lewis inheritance customs. Angelus accepted the decision more easily than Levy expected, though Tulip still had its own succession problems waiting. Nelson blessed the child without pretending one ceremony could simplify the politics surrounding his birth. Anduin slept through most of it, unimpressed by adults reorganizing noble futures around him. The child changed how Levy measured Stormwind's risks. Losing the territory had always meant losing years of work and the people depending on him. Now failure could also hand his son whatever enemies survived Levy's generation. That was not comforting, but comfort had never built Stormwind's defenses. Levy left Tulip with another reason to make the frontier strong enough to outlive him. Personal ambition had carried the first desperate years. Inheritance demanded institutions that still functioned after his own talents were gone. Panda found the entire situation much more entertaining than Levy considered appropriate. Priest Nelson's presence around Tulip also reminded Levy that Anduin would attract political attention from childhood. A child between two powerful territorial lines would never be allowed to remain only a child for long. Stormwind answered that personal revelation with another military opportunity before Levy could enjoy much peace. Lahi returned injured after encountering a migration of wind spirit-winged tigers. More than 20 of the flying beasts had entered the wider Stormwind region. Most stood around the 4th and 5th tiers, while the Tiger King had reached the 6th. Their strength mattered less than the fact that the entire species could be tamed. Levy looked at the report and immediately saw future flying squadrons wearing fur. He assembled more than 100 professionals, sharpshooters, and mages for a controlled capture operation. Killing the beasts would provide materials once. Taming them could produce military value for years. The team used traps, ranged pressure, and overwhelming local superiority instead of heroic duels. Several tigers tested the encirclement and found every useful escape path covered by professionals. Lahi helped communicate the difference between submission and becoming expensive corpses. The Tiger King resisted longest because leadership apparently included refusing obvious arithmetic. Eventually, the migration became another Stormwind resource instead of another border hazard. Training began immediately, while handlers learned which beasts tolerated riders and which tolerated only violence. 2 aerial squadrons would not appear overnight, but the foundation had arrived under its own wings. Levy used the same period to complete another branch of elemental magic. Ice spells accumulated until the panel could fuse them into a new innate ability. Extreme Cold Ice Prison formed as wide area control rather than another simple damage burst. Cold currents could lock weaker enemies in place and heavily slow stronger professionals. That mattered because Levy already possessed plenty of ways to kill targets he could reach. The harder problem was stopping powerful opponents from leaving before his attacks finished them. Levy raised the spell through the 6th level and watched both its radius and suppression improve. Only one bronze innate spell remained before his elemental framework reached another milestone. Stormwind now fielded Bloodfire, artillery, flying beasts undead, recovery magic, and freezing control. The territory's combat system was becoming several unfair ideas cooperating at the same time. Every new weapon, however, demanded administrators, handlers, teachers, sailors, mages, and maintenance crews. Levy had solved his earliest manpower shortage by buying skilled slaves from Grey Fortress. At Stormwind's current scale, skilled people were becoming the bottleneck again at a much higher level. Then the shipyards delivered proof that months of design and training were finally becoming real. In mid-March of the following year, Stormwind's first naval warship entered the water. Citizens crowded the shoreline around a vessel that looked closer to a moving fortress than a merchant ship. Creel walked the deck with the expression of someone seeing his new command become physically unavoidable. The launch mattered beyond pride, because the 2nd and 3rd warships were already under construction. Stormwind's navy had stopped being a future plan inside Levy's notebooks. It was now timber, enchanted equipment, trained sailors, and a budget large enough to hurt. The same week, 2 visitors arrived carrying an old family problem. Bentley came with 13-year-old Ethan from the Lewis family and asked Levy for help. Ethan was nearing the age when his inheritance claim could become legally decisive. Colin intended to seize the Lewis barony before that happened. The Launchy family supported Colin through a 5th-tier warrior, turning inheritance pressure into an armed threat. Bentley finally knelt with Ethan because polite letters had already lost their value. Levy looked at the boy and saw part of the household that had once expelled him. He also saw the launch name attached to the threat and became interested for a cleaner reason. Old resentment alone was not enough reason to start a territorial conflict. A hostile family using armed professionals against a legal inheritance claim gave him something far easier to justify. Before Levy could act, another messenger arrived from the northwest carrying a problem involving 30 magical horses. The message came through Horde of the Lincoln family. Quint, Stormwind's famously slippery slave trader, had bought 30 fiery steeds on the Blackrock black market. Blackrock royal forces and the Lexus family then chased him toward the wild mountains. A Lincoln patrol rescued Quint before both merchant and horses disappeared. The Lincoln family now wanted Levy personally to negotiate their return. Levy confirmed Quint worked for Stormwind and immediately started calculating why his own presence mattered. 30 magical beast horses were too valuable to retrieve quietly once the Northwest Legion knew they existed. Trying to steal them back could turn one merchant problem into an insult against an allied ducal house. So Levy traveled northwest to meet a family whose history explained more than the current negotiation. The Lincoln family had been driven from Black Rock 3 centuries earlier and rebuilt across Alpha's frontier. Reclaiming that homeland remained a long-term ambition even after generations passed. The disagreement inside Lincoln concerned timing rather than desire. Most leaders favored patience, alliances, and enough preparation to make a return survivable. A more aggressive faction had forced the issue years earlier and paid heavily. Klein came from that damaged branch, which explained his complicated relationship with the central family. Levy suddenly understood why the former Grey Fortress captain always mixed ability with political distance. Family history had exiled Klein long before Stormwind ever met him. Current Lincoln leaders offered Levy a practical bargain instead of sentimental reunion stories. If they eventually moved against Black Rock, Stormwind could join as an autonomous allied force. Alpha's military merit system would recognize the campaign, and Lincoln would not order Stormwind into suicidal attacks. Levy refused any promise that endangered his territory regardless of future circumstances. Lincoln accepted because a voluntary ally was still worth more than a resentful subordinate. The agreement stayed deliberately flexible, useful enough to matter and loose enough not to become a chain. Stormwind expanded wine and sugar trade through Lincoln routes in return. Lincoln protection would make those channels safer and give Quint fewer chances to become another regional emergency. Levy recovered the 30 fiery steeds without starting a diplomatic fight over ownership. He then diverted 24 magical beast horses toward Klein on terms generous enough to look suspicious. Klein stared at the mounts and asked what hidden favor would arrive later. Levy told him to treat the horses as credit and complain after his cavalry became faster. Klein saw through the excuse but accepted because pride did not train mounted squadrons. The transaction carried more meaning than its paperwork admitted. Stormwind was helping rebuild the man who had helped Levy survive Grey Fortress years earlier. The remaining fiery steeds joined Clay's understrength knight formation. By then, the first naval warship was already active, while the second and third moved through construction. July became the target for placing more hulls into service. Levy returned to cultivation with one elemental gap still bothering him. Bronze magic remained the final major branch needed to complete the tower structure he believed he understood. Using the heart of the Bronze King, he formed another mental magic tower. For one hopeful moment, the 9th tower looked like the end of an orderly progression. Then a light element tower appeared beyond the pattern Levy thought should exist. 10 towers now occupied a mental sea whose standard structure had never promised room for 10. The result felt like a building discovering an extra floor had been added without asking the foundation. The towers collided, cracked, and began tearing one another apart inside Levy's consciousness. Pain hit before he could safely dismantle any single structure. For several seconds, Stormwind's greatest immediate threat was architecture inside its own lord's head. The panel intervened before the collapse destroyed his mental sea. Instead of choosing one tower to preserve, it fused all 10 into a single structure. A 10-story mental magic tower rose through Levy's consciousness. Each floor corresponded to one elemental path and held the innate spell tied to that branch. Light and dark took their places beside earth, fire, lightning, wind, water, life, ice, and brawn. Levy stared at the finished structure and accepted that ordinary magical education had stopped being a useful comparison. The final bronze innate spell emerged from the fused system as Death Sword. Its name was simple because the function did not need decoration. The spell created remote sword control built around speed, penetration, and lethal single-target attacks. Higher levels would increase both range and velocity. Levy tested the ability with an enchanted long sword and immediately discovered that the spell had standards. At first, the 6th-tier weapon barely moved under his control. Apparently, even magical flying swords required practice before agreeing to look impressive. Levy raised the skill, inscribed the necessary model, and tried again. This time, the long sword lifted cleanly and moved through the air under remote direction. He drove it higher until the weapon became a silver streak against open sky. Its speed already exceeded what many 6th-tier professionals could react to. Levy sent it downward, recalled it, and attacked the training hill from another angle. The useful question was not how dramatic the spell looked, but how far the mental link remained stable. He switched to the purple water silver sword because its spellcaster construction responded more smoothly. The blade traveled beyond visible detail, while Levy maintained control through the innate spell. 1 kilometer passed, then several more, with mental strain rising gradually rather than suddenly. Around 8 kilometers, the connection reached the point where pushing farther risked losing control. Levy stopped extending the range and ordered the sword back at maximum speed. The weapon crossed the distance like a violent line drawn through the landscape. Trees split before nearby leaves finished reacting to the pressure wave. Seconds later, the purple water silver sword hovered beside Levy again, as though nothing unusual had happened. He tested 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th tier enchanted blades afterward. The most expensive sword was not automatically the best partner for Death Sword. Spellcaster weapons responded better because their structures were designed for continuous magical manipulation. That suggested Stormwind should eventually forge a dedicated flying sword instead of adapting ordinary enchanted weapons. Levy filed the project for after his advancement to 7th tier Archmage. Until then, the purple water silver sword offered more than enough lethal reach. A stationary mage, artillery crew, or distracted high-tier target could now die kilometers away without Levy entering the same engagement zone. The spell also threatened enemies specifically prepared to counter his close-range speed. Death Sword did not replace No Distance or Thunder Dragon techniques. It made guessing Levy's preferred range into another dangerous mistake. The test ended when Levy noticed how much forest he had accidentally converted into debris. Future range experiments, he decided. Stormwind did not plan to harvest soon. Back at the mansion, Levy reviewed Chaos Meditation progress and his remaining Blood Spirit potions. More than half of the 6th-tier cultivation path was already complete before he touched the reserve. 15 6th-tier Blood Spirit potions could push another meaningful portion forward. For the first time, 7th-tier felt close enough to schedule rather than simply desire. Storm Academy continued producing quieter changes while its lord experimented with lethal flying metal. Annie, Jenkins's daughter, had become an apprentice water mage. R'Lel, Roger's younger brother, approached the 1st tier along the lightning path. 3 new 1st-tier knights and 4 1st-tier warriors graduated into Stormwind's growing professional pool. Parker's son Langdon had reached 18 and stood close to the 2nd tier. Those names mattered more to Levy than anonymous recruitment totals. Stormwind was finally producing professionals from families already rooted inside the territory. Its population had passed 100,000 after another wave of purchased serfs arrived following the war. More than 20,000 newcomers alone entered during that expansion. Among the adults, only a handful showed magical talent strong enough for immediate academy priority. Loki carried earth as a secondary affinity. Lisa possessed water as her strongest path across 3 elements. Leo showed fire as his main affinity within a 4-element profile. The yield disappointed Levy compared with Stormwind's growing need for trained mages. Population growth did not guarantee talent growth at the same rate. That reality pushed the academy toward developing ordinary professionals efficiently instead of waiting for miracles. The standing army expanded alongside the population and the longer defensive line. 25 infantry companies replaced the tiny formation Stormwind, once counted almost man by man. Regular cavalry grew from 2 companies to 6. Archers expanded from 6 companies to 8. The Cane River fortresses moved from planning into concrete deployment. Clay took command of Cane 1 fortress with infantry, archers, regular cavalry, and storm cannon support. Garcia received a similar structure at Cane 2 fortress. Roger's magical beast horse squadrons prepared for consolidation as the mounted arm professionalized. Levy had begun with 1 city that could die if 50 men chose the wrong gate. Now he was designing separate fortresses whose districts each exceeded his original military strength. The achievement felt enormous until he looked at the coastline, mountains, roads, and settlements still uncovered. Expansion kept turning yesterday's impossible army into tomorrow's minimum staffing requirement. Late July brought another experiment from Stormwind's growing alchemy program. Levy constructed a 4th-tier St. Bernard Earthhound through alchemical methods and lay gold. The golem worked, which was exactly why the result annoyed him. Its combat strength reached the expected tier, but the magical crystal cost made mass production unattractive. An army could burn money faster than Bluefire if every disposable construct carried expensive energy cores. Levy concluded that ordinary sub-7th-tier golems needed a special advantage before large-scale production made economic sense. A successful prototype could still be a failed strategic answer. That lesson pleased him more than pretending every new technology deserved deployment. Then September brought Angelus to Stormwind with Anduin in her arms. The visit was no longer private enough for Levy to delay what the child's existence meant politically. Officials gathered while citizens traded rumors faster than any announcement could control them. On Anduin's first birthday, Levy publicly gave the child his full recognized name. Anduin Storm became Stormwind's acknowledged heir before outside nobles could invent a different interpretation. The declaration shifted succession calculations around the territory immediately. Old Charlie watched the boy with the expression of someone remembering the terrified 16-year-old he once escorted north. Clay had followed Levy through walls, ambush, monster, and armies. Now he was watching the same lord create a succession problem simply by having a family. After the formal celebration, Angelus raised the obvious complication. Anduin could inherit Stormwind, but Tulip still needed its own long-term succession answer. Levy suggested that the child's birthday meal was a terrible time to solve dynastic law. Angelus replied that political inheritance rarely waited for convenient scheduling. Her suggestions involving Wendy and Amy made Levy suddenly much more interested in fortress budgets. Panda heard about the conversation later and laughed hard enough to become useless for serious consultation. Behind the humor, the problem remained real. Dempty-human and half-elf bloodlines complicated ordinary inheritance expectations on both sides. Levy had contingency plans for armies, trade magic, and assassinations. Family politics remained annoyingly resistant to artillery. The Lewis inheritance dispute gave him a convenient reason to redirect attention southward. Angelus joined him because Lanchi involvement interested Tulip as well. They traveled quietly instead of announcing a Viscount and Marquis through every checkpoint. Roughly 10 kilometers before Viscount launches city, Levy's recognition talent erupted with its strongest warning. An 8th-tier shadow ghost-killing array waited ahead. 4 8th-tier archmages controlled the formation. The warning described the area as extremely dangerous, without offering any comforting ambiguity. Levy stopped immediately and felt cold sweat before Angelus even asked what he had sensed. An 8th-tier killing formation inside an ordinary Viscount city made no sense if the target was only the Lanchi family. Levy told Angelus the trap was almost certainly meant for him and Panda. The temple likely expected his conflict with Lanchi to draw Stormwind's strongest protector south. The obvious 9th-tier assassin might not even be standing near the array. A saint could wait farther away, then strike Panda after every prepared escape route had already closed. Angelus asked what could have exposed Levy badly enough for Shadow Temple to prepare this personally. He named Bloodfire oil, intelligence about the Shadow King, and every secret their enemies could have pieced together. Then both of them considered a more dangerous possibility. The trap ahead might be only half of the operation. Panda had remained in Stormwind partly because Anduin was now too important to leave without overwhelming protection. Calling him south could walk directly into the enemy's plan while opening Levy's home to a second attack. Angelus rejected that option before Levy finished considering it. If Shadow Temple had studied Stormwind properly, they would expect Panda to respond when Levy faced lethal danger. The safest answer was refusing to move the piece the enemy had prepared to manipulate. Levy disliked leaving his strongest ally unused, but the logic was difficult to challenge. Fortunately, Angelus carried a connection the temple might not have calculated. Priest Nelson had given her a badge capable of contacting the Church of Dawn at the highest useful level. Angelus activated it and delivered the warning, without revealing more than the operation required. The Church responded quickly because an 8th-tier shadow ghost-killing array inside Alpha was not a local noble dispute. Temple activity at that scale threatened far more than one inheritance case. Levy and Angelus stayed outside the city instead of testing whether recognition had exaggerated anything. Waiting felt unnatural after years of solving danger by moving faster than it expected. This time, patience became part of the counterattack. Church forces approached under concealment, while Levy monitored the hostile formation from beyond its effective range. Inside Lanchi City, the conspirators continued behaving as though their bait had worked. Viscount Lanch and Lady Judy were involved deeply enough that ordinary excuses no longer mattered. Arnold and several others tied to the Lewis dispute had already been trapped under poison and illusion. Hellfire poison kept victims weak while false perceptions prevented them from understanding what had happened. Ethan's family conflict was no longer merely an attempted inheritance theft. Someone had turned a minor noble dispute into infrastructure for a Shadow Temple assassination. That conversion made the Lanchi title considerably less valuable than the evidence hidden beneath it. When Church of Dawn professionals entered the city, the killing array stopped being an invisible advantage. The hunters waiting for Panda became conspirators defending illegal hell magic against church forces. Lady Judy and Viscount Lanchi used a void travel scroll before the encirclement fully closed. Spatial light swallowed them before every escape direction could be sealed. Levy watched another enemy disappear and resisted the familiar urge to chase without information. Paul had already taught him enough about pursuing people carrying unknown spatial relics. The remaining temple personnel lost their best exits once the city came under church control. Hidden chambers opened and formation nodes were dismantled one after another. Poisoned victims were recovered alive beneath layers of illusion and hellfire toxin. Church priests began treatment, while investigators traced servants, officers, and nobles who had supported the setup. The scene made Ethan's original inheritance problem look almost painfully ordinary by comparison. He had asked Levy to stop one relative from stealing a barony. The investigation instead uncovered a hell-backed ambush built around the same family's greed. A small noble house had made itself useful to a legendary enemy organization and would now pay through courts, confiscations, and testimony. For Levy, the urgent question was why Shadow Temple had escalated so quickly. A 9th-tier priest named Martinez took over part of the church response. Once the city was secured, he escorted Levy and Angelus toward Lewis City, instead of letting them continue alone. Priest Nelson was already waiting there after receiving the emergency contact. His presence confirmed the church considered the operation much larger than a poisoned Viscount household. Levy explained the danger warning, the formation structure, and his suspicion that Panda had been the intended secondary target. Nelson agreed that the design fit a deliberate saint-level hunting plan, rather than ordinary regional intimidation. 4 8th-tier archmages could sustain the formation, while a stronger killer waited beyond immediate detection. The plan depended on Stormwind responding predictably when Levy was threatened. Angelus pointed out the part that bothered her even more. If Panda had left Stormwind, Anduin and the territory itself might have become the second battlefield. Shadow Temple no longer needed to defeat Levy directly if it could make protecting everything impossible. Levy had spent years building redundancy into food, weapons, forts, trade routes, and military command. His personal security still depended too heavily on one 9th-tier protector standing in the correct place. That realization irritated him because Panda's strength had become a weakness enemies could plan around. Panda could win most fights Stormwind faced. He could not occupy two provinces at the same time. Nelson said the church would pursue the Lanchet fugitives and trace the network that supported the array. That solved the investigation, not the structural weakness exposed by the ambush. Stormwind needed stronger local saints, stronger arrays, and more independent high-tier combat power. Levy needed to advance quickly enough that every enemy plan did not begin by isolating Panda. Angelus needed similar growth, because Tulip's connection to him made her a permanent target as well. For a quiet stretch inside Lewis City, nobody discussed titles, trade, or the estate Levy had once left behind. The place represented an earlier life when becoming a formal knight had seemed distant. Now 8th-tier killing arrays and hidden 9th-tier assassins were being prepared specifically for his arrival. Success had changed the scale of danger more reliably than it changed the amount of danger. Levy walked through familiar halls and found almost nothing emotionally familiar about himself. The boy expelled from this family had once lacked enough power to argue with an older brother. The man returning now forced royal armies, churches, and hell organizations to plan around his movements. That satisfaction lasted about 1 minute. Then Levy remembered Shadow Temple had probably spent months preparing a trap he noticed only because of recognition. The talent had saved him again, but depending on one warning skill forever was another kind of weakness. He needed enough power to survive some traps even after detection failed. Nelson recommended caution until church intelligence mapped regional Shadow Temple activity more completely. Levy agreed outwardly and immediately began planning how to accelerate cultivation without waiting for safety. Panda needed resources capable of moving a 9th-tier sacred beast closer to legend. Levy needed energy essence, better methods, and opportunities that did not require dying first. Storm Academy could produce more professionals, but its strongest ceiling still lagged behind the enemies now watching Stormwind. The Navy added reach, flying squadrons added speed, fortresses added endurance. None of those replaced people capable of standing in front of a saint and refusing to disappear. The failed ambush had shown exactly which layer of Stormwind remained too thin. Levy hated giving enemies credit, but useful fear could become preparation instead of paralysis. He sent orders north before leaving Lewis City. Watches around Anduin and critical facilities would tighten immediately. Panda was not to leave Stormwind merely because rumors or distant emergencies demanded it. Key arrays around the city would be reviewed for blind spots and hidden approaches. Naval patrols would treat unidentified high-tier passengers as threats rather than automatically important guests. Flying squads would expand reconnaissance beyond the roads ordinary spies preferred. Clay and Garcia would revise Kane Fortress response plans for attacks arriving from inside human territory. Shadow Temple had used a noble family instead of an orc army. Stormwind's defenses now needed to work against silk robes as effectively as claws. Angelus sent similar warnings through tulip channels and quietly reviewed which relatives knew Anduin's routines. Parenthood was beginning to sound disturbingly similar to protecting a military secret. Levy said Anduin deserved at least one childhood problem that did not involve hell. Angelus replied that this depended on whether his father could stop collecting legendary enemies. Levy considered promising to improve, and decided neither of them would believe it. Nelson left agents around Lewis and Lanchy territory, while Martinez coordinated the immediate cleanup. The church wanted to study the Shadow Ghost killing array before dismantling every surviving trace. Understanding how the formation concealed itself could help detect another one before a target crossed into range. Levy offered Stormwind's formation specialists for any non-restricted findings the church could share. Nelson agreed because duplicated expertise was suddenly more valuable than institutional pride. One assassination attempt had become intelligence, formation research, security doctrine, and another reason to train faster. The enemy had spent 4 8th-tier archmages preparing a grave. Levy intended to turn that grave into a manual for refusing the next burial. Before departure, he visited Ethan and Bentley to settle what still could be resolved without another war. The Lanch family's exposed Shadow Temple connection had destroyed much of Colin's outside protection. Ethan's inheritance claim no longer stood against an untouchable patron. Legal pressure, church investigation, and Levy's presence shifted the balance without requiring a siege. Bentley thanked him as though the original family conflict had been the largest problem on the board. Levy almost envied that scale of worry. A stolen barony could be reclaimed through law and force, an enemy organization with saints, hell passages, patient assassins, and months to prepare required a different future. When Levy finally turned north toward Stormwind, the road looked peaceful enough to feel suspicious. No orc scouts moved across the horizon. No Bloodfire burned in prepared trenches. The quiet made the recent warning feel more important rather than less. Enemies had learned they did not need armies to threaten everything Levy built. A city could survive a siege and still lose everything to one correctly placed formation. Stormwind had spent years becoming too hard for ordinary invaders to swallow. Now it had become valuable enough for stronger predators to plan around its teeth. Levy's next task was not proving the frontier could survive one more crisis. It was making survival scale faster than the enemies studying Stormwind, while Shadow Temple continued counting weaknesses from somewhere beyond the church's reach.